Thank you. There's a commonly repeated statistic that states communism was the cause of over 100 million deaths. What most people don't realize is that a Russian scientist was the cause for almost half of them. His name was Trofim Lysenko. He was an agronomist in the early 20th century with a peasant background and rose to power under Stalin's regime. He wasn't exactly the brightest scientific prospect. He didn't learn to read or write until 13 and never learned another language, which was a basic requirement for scientists back when science journals were published in Western languages. But what he lacked in scientific rigor, he made up with his undying loyalty to communism and a lack of ethical and moral values. You see, mainstream science back then knew that genetic inheritance determined how crops grew. They knew that genes, the primary drivers of traits, are passed from one generation to the next. Lysenko, however, argued that genes did not exist. He claimed that traditional biology was a Western bourgeois capitalist lie. Instead, he argued that if you exposed a plant to the right environment, you could force it to change its nature entirely, and it would pass those new traits to its offspring. For example, rather than using the established selective breeding methods, he believed you could simply train your seeds by storing them in a cold environment, and that they would then become cold-tolerant plant when they were grown. This is all completely wrong. Joseph Stalin, though, he loved it. Why? Because it fit the communist political narrative. The idea that anything, plants, people, society, could be reshaped by willpower and the state. Because Lysenko had the backing of the political leader, his false science became the official law. Real biologists who pointed to actual data were labeled as elites and part of a corrupt establishment. Thousands of scientists were fired, imprisoned, or executed. The result, Lysenko's farming methods were rolled out across Russia and China for decades, with devastating effects. The crops failed, and 30 to 50 million people starved to death. Lysenkoism is a prime historical example of what happens when loyalty to a political brand overrides objective truth. And this is where the echo of history rings loudly in the modern era. While the MAGA movement is yet to start throwing scientists into gulags, the rhetorical mechanics it relies on are chillingly similar to Lysenkoism in three distinct ways. First is the weaponization of anti-elitism. Lysenko was celebrated because he was a common peasant, relying on his gut, unlike those out-of-touch academic biologists. Today we see a political movement that actively distrusts doctors, climatologists, election officials, and institutional experts. The gut feeling of the leader, or the common sense of the crowd, is elevated above empirical data. Second is the demand for alternative realities. Just as Soviet ideology couldn't tolerate the laws of genetics, the MAGA movement frequently rejects objective data if it contradicts the political narrative. Whether it is denying the consensus on COVID's dangers or origins, climate change, or the safety of vaccines, the MAGA movement requires its followers to adopt a politically approved version of reality. And the third is the purge of the dissenters. In Lysenko's time, disagreeing with his fake science meant you were an enemy of the state. In the MAGA framework, disagreeing with the leader labels you as part of the deep state. Anthony Fauci, anyone? Truth and data is no longer a defense. Loyalty is the only metric of value in both Lysenkoism and MAGA. When a political movement, whether in the 1930s Russia or modern-day America, decides that expertise is the enemy, that institutions are inherently corrupt, and that reality must bend to the ego of a leader, the foundation for a failing nation is laid. And tonight you are voting on a matter that requires an alternative reality to justify a yes vote. Because the reality is, if Illinois were to split in two out of spite for Chicago, you have to ignore the following realities. You would have less money if we lose Cook County's GDP and county tax base. We would instantly inherit our per capita share of Illinois' massive unfunded pension liabilities and state debt. And you have to ignore the only way to effect a separation is if both the Illinois and U.S. General Assembly approve it. Tonight we get to see firsthand who values reason and who prefers to practice their own style of Lysenkoism. So I recommend you vote wisely. Thank you. Thank you.